Hello, and welcome to the 5th module of this course. In this lesson, we'll cover the use of nested compositions, as well as how to use them to create scene transitions, essential graphics, and mats. Let's get started. Working with nested comps. In previous lessons, you might have noticed that After Effects has the ability to create comps, and then add them inside of other comps. This is what we call nested comps. Nested comps are really handy, but there are a few important things we need to know when we work with them. This will make our lives and work pipeline easier down the line. We can create nested comps in two ways. The first way is by creating the comps individually by pressing Command-Control+N, or directly on our project panel, and then dragging and dropping them into our new composition. The second one is by pre-composing layers inside a composition. We can do this by selecting our layer and pressing Command-Control+Shift+C. A new window will pop up asking for the name of the new composition, and we'll have two options to choose from underneath. The first option is only available when pre-composing a single layer, and what it'll do is create a new composition using the layer, but all effects and parameters animated on the layer will stay behind and be applied to the nested composition in our main timeline. The second option will keep all the parameters and effects on the layer and bring them into the nested comp. The second option is only available when pre-composing multiple layers, as it would be impossible to have all parameters and effects from multiple layers applied to a single composition. Nested Comp Management. By now we know that layer and project management for our After Effects files are very important. Comp and nested comp management is equally as important, especially for large projects. We need to ensure that our naming conventions are set from the beginning, or finding and making changes down the line will be quite troublesome. For our projects, we will have a hierarchy structure based on scenes. This means we will have all our scenes divided into different folders, each with its own asset used in that scene. If we look at the project panel, we can see that for this project, I have a main comp outside the folder structure. This is where we place or nest each of our scene comps and can add comp overlaps or scene transitions as needed. Next, we have the Assets folder, where we can place general project asset folders like the solids, voiceovers, music, logos, and any other assets we might need to use in the project. Then we have our Scenes folder, and inside it, we have a folder for each of the scenes in this project. And as you might have guessed, inside each of the folders, we have subfolders for scene assets, including Illustrator files and their layers, Photoshop files and their layers, video footage, and images. Scene Pre-Comps. We call pre-comps our nested comps, and depending on the complexity of the project, we might even have more folders inside this one to organize the nested comps. Scene Composition. This is the complete scene that is ready to be imported into our main project composition. As you'll probably see, all nested compositions for Scene 1 start their name with scene_A, and then followed by the name or identifier for that nested comp. We should take care in naming these comps correctly, not only for a more structured file management, but to make it easier to search for when using our Finder field. This also benefits others using our project file, as they can easily find and understand what is happening in the animation and make amendments with ease. Having this file structure in our projects makes it easier to work with nested comps. I know that having so many naming conventions in Illustrator and After Effects and creating the folder structure might feel overwhelming, but it will become second nature once you start doing it constantly, and your teammates will be grateful when working with your files. Something that we need to keep in mind and try to avoid is creating too many levels of nested compositions in our projects. What I mean by this is better explained in the following example. As you can see, I have a scene named Scene A. I have a nested composition, Scene A Car, and inside of that, I have nested comps for Scene A Car Wheels and Scene A Car Body. If I go inside of Wheels, I have more layers and more nested comps called Scene A Car Wheels Lug Nuts and Scene A Wheel Shapes. If we look at the structure, we are already 4 levels deep into the Scene A comp, and this might create problems when managing this project, as each part of the car will have more and more nested comps inside of it. Not only will names become larger and harder to identify, but we also make it harder to move, update, or erase something through these levels of compositions. We also risk breaking things on the upper levels of our scenes. As good practice, we shouldn't go further than comping to 2 or 3 levels. Also, thanks to Essential Graphics, it's now easier to manage our levels without having to go into deeper levels to change minor things. Just try to avoid having nested comps with Essential Graphics inside of other Essential Graphics compositions. Problems and workarounds. With software as versatile as After Effects, I'm sure you've already realized that features come with their own terms, limitations, and problems. Problems that, if we're unaware of, might end up giving us a headache later on. One of the biggest problems of working with nested compositions comes from how we create them. We can make nested compositions by pre-composing layers into a new composition directly in our timeline by going to Layer, Pre-compose, or by pressing Command-Control-Shift+C. What could possibly be the problem with that? Well, it comes in the form of the default size After Effects uses to create the pre-composition. And since it's using the size of the composition it originated from, our anchor point will now be the center of a 1920 by 1080 composition. This creates a few problems. For example, it means that if we try to rotate an object, After Effects will use the center of the comp as its pivot point. And even though you can move the anchor point by using the Pan Behind tool, by pressing Y on your keyboard. Trying to do this manually might bring undesired results. Like with this wheel, for example, it will take a lot of effort and time to rotate around its true center. The next problem comes from the bounding box or selection box of our nested layer. You'll notice that if I try to select the object, even if it's not that big in my composition, I'll end up selecting the entire bounding box. And what's even worse is the fact that if I try to select one of the objects that is behind my nested comp on my canvas, since my bounding box now covers everything, it will always select that layer. So how do we fix this problem? The easiest way to do it is by going inside our nested comp and adding a null. Then choose the layer that will be our center, in this case the wheel, and copying and pasting the position of the wheel layer to the null. This will place the null's anchor point in the middle of the wheel. Now I can parent all my layers to this null, and once that's done, I can right-click over the null's position and click on Reset to bring it back to the center of the composition. Now the center point of my object is the same as the center point of my nested composition, and if I spin it, it will do so perfectly. Now that this works, we can fix the bounding box, and for this, we have 2 solutions. The first option, and the one I recommend, is, as you might have expected, to crop the size of my nested composition to make it the same size as my layers. If we press Command-Control-K, we'll bring up the composition settings where we can change the values for the size that will contract or expand based off of the center of the composition. So if I make this composition 500 by 500, you'll see that my object is still centered. The other option available to fix the bounding box is not one that I recommend. You can turn on the continuous rasterize option for the nested comp layer in the timeline, and this option sort of fixes the bounding box, but it brings its own set of issues. If I go ahead and turn it on, you can see this changes the bounding box to the shape of my object. But you'll notice on this example where I haven't changed the center point of my shape. It keeps the original 1920 by 1080 anchor point position and doesn't move it to the new shape's bounding box. As you can see, if I try selecting the layers underneath by clicking on them, I can do it perfectly. The biggest problem with using the continuous rasterize option on your pre-comp is that it tends to break or not make certain effects not work as intended. To explain this better, I have 2 layers on screen. The one layer is using an effect called CC Page Turn and has been animated, and the other layer has an effect called CC Ball Action applied to it with no animation. If I pre-compose this layer and then try to scale them, you'll see everything works as intended. But as soon as I turn the continuous rasterize button and scale them, you'll see things start to break. As you can see, they break in different ways. My CC page turn effect is having problems rendering. My CC ball action layer seems to be updating itself while it scales. I can't list all the different ways things might break since it changes depending on your content. Just be aware that if you're animating an effect or property inside a nested composition, and it seems to be acting differently than expected, try toggling the continuous rasterize option on and off and check if that could be the problem. Speaking of continuous rasterize, there's another thing we need to discuss about its use in nested comps. We don't want our vector layers to be pixelated, so in order to avoid this, we need to go inside of the nested comp and turn on the continuous rasterize option for all the vector layers. Otherwise, it will not work even if the switch is turned on for the entire nested comp. You can see this happening in my scene where I did not toggle the continuous rasterize effect on one of the layers. Now when I scale up the nested comp, we can clearly see that one of the objects stays sharp while the other looks pixelated. This same principle applies to other toggle effects on our layers, like the motion blur or 3D layer switches. If the effect is not toggled on the layer and the nested comp, then it will not work. Finally, the other thing we need to take into account when working with the continuous rasterize option is that if our nested comp has any adjustment layers with effects on them, these effects will be applied to the layers under the nested comp. In this example, you can see the nested comp has an adjustment layer with a hue saturation effect applied to it. If I go back to my main comp and turn the continuous rasterize switch on, this effect gets applied to all the layers underneath. One thing you should always consider when working with nested comps is the impact of comps in different animated layers and effects. Large amounts of effects and comps will consume more resources from your computer and will increase the amount of time it takes to render. If this happens, you can always pre-render any of these nested comps and then import the rendered file and place them on top of your nested comp. Then you can turn off all the other layers, and this will help After Effects render the projects faster. Remember that if you have any pre-comps with a transparent background, you need to export your video with an alpha channel so that the pre-render works properly. Conclusion: working with nested comps can be a great way to structure our project. However, we need to be really careful as to how we organize them, as well as knowing their limits and prepare for how things might break or not work as intended.